When I moved back into my grandfather's lakeside house 3 months ago, I honestly thought I had stumbled into the quiet reset I had always wanted, a sanctuary far from the city apartments and the constant churn of landlord notices and neighbor disputes, the kind of place where you wake up in the morning to mist floating over the lake like a silk sheet, where birds make the only noise worth hearing, and where every memory of fishing with my father when I was a boy tugged me forward into. Imagining teaching others, fulfilling my old kayak instructor certification, turning something peaceful into something meaningful again. But peace doesn't survive long when someone needs power, and in Meadowbrook Lake that someone had a name: Paula Whitman. My first introduction to her wasn't a neighborly wave or a casserole delivered to welcome me. It was a hard rap of knuckles against my door on a Tuesday morning, the crunch of gravel under impatient steps followed by the sight of a clipboard hugged to her chest and the kind of plastic smile that makes you feel less welcomed and more summoned. And though she said, "Welcome to our little community," the way an IRS agent might say, "We're here to help," the papers she shoved toward me slapped the friendliness away. An initiation fee of $200, monthly dues of $150 for lake and surrounding area maintenance. A contract that nobody gets to live by the lake without signing. I chuckled politely, tried to hand the papers back with a calm, "I appreciate you stopping by, but I'm not interested in joining any HO," because in truth I hadn't even known my grandfather's property belonged to one, and as far as I could tell no orange buoys bobbing in calm water, no dock creaking against the bank, hinted at problems worth higher fees. But Paula's mask shattered instantly, her whole posture stiffening into battle stance. Her voice sharpened like filing metal. "Nobody lives here without joining the HO, she spat, her gaze scanning me as though measuring how quickly she could bulldoze me, and when I told her politely that I'd already been paying property taxes on this land since inheriting it, that my title and deed made clear this was my grandfather's dock and water rights, she snapped upright, clipped her words like bullets. "This is community lake property, and you're trespassing every time you step foot near that water without paying your dues." The absurdity stunned me into silence long enough for her to whip out her phone and call 911 like she was reporting an armed robbery. Imagine standing on the porch of the house your grandfather built, your fishing buoys bobbing outside on water you've loved since childhood, while a stranger in a blazer dials in willful trespassing against you. It would have been laughable if not for the heavy sound of a patrol car rolling up the gravel 20 minutes later, red and blue echoes splashing against the pine trunks. Officer Owen Bennett stepping out with that tired look cops wear when they realize it's another HOA complaint. Paula launched into her monologue with the urgency of a prosecutor on opening day, pointing down the hill, yelling about community resources stolen, illegal buoys marking stolen water, me refusing to pay fees. I tried to explain, feeling half mad at speaking obvious truth, that this was my grandfather's parcel, surveyed, taxed, deeded, every inch paid legally, but this was no place for truth. This was theater, and Paula was cast as queen. Bennett scribbled, pretending patience, and when he finally closed his notebook he sighed and said the deflating words of a man who's been in this scene too many times. "I'm just here to document. This is a civil matter, not a criminal one," and walked off, leaving Paula seething at my doorstep with cheeks flushed red, announcing to the quiet woods that she was closing the dock for 48 hours, until I signed her papers, declaring her decrees with the authority of a monarch. I thought that was the end of it until I walked down to the dock that afternoon, looked at the orange safety buoys I dropped to mark the kayak boundary, and suddenly felt a shiver of unease. Not because they were misplaced, but because Paula had spoken with such conviction about community ownership that it made me question my own footing, flipping through my grandfather's manila folders in the basement that night, chasing dusty surveyor notes that mentioned lake surface rights in a language so dense it felt like code. By morning she was back, this time with reinforcements. 2 neighbors flanking her like bodyguards, a stack of papers fluttering with official-looking seals she spread across my porch table, angling the pages just so I'd see the stamps but never the fine print. "Certified county-filed bylaws," she said smugly, proving legal authority over all community water resources, pointing her pen like a sword, accusing me of stealing from everyone, her allies nodding nervously, one shifting his weight like he wasn't sure why he was there at all. When Bennett returned in his cruiser that afternoon, responding to another round of trespassing, I mentioned how I'd been paying lake surface property taxes every single year, and for the first time his scribbling stopped, his brow narrowed, and Paula's mask cracked for a blink. She recovered with fury, yapping about how taxes don't override HOA regulation, but Bennett just clicked his notebook shut and said flatly, "Ma'am, this isn't a police matter. If you have a legitimate claim, File it civilly. Don't keep calling emergency services. Watching her gather her faux evidence with jerky, angry movements was satisfying for a flicker, but her promise, "I'll be posting neighborhood notices," carried a chill. By the next morning, flyers screamed across lampposts, bold red letters. Urgent community notice, unauthorized lake usage by new resident, my face grainy, my dock circled in pen like crime scene evidence. Strangers I'd never met whispered as they passed, as though a man who placed buoys for kayak safety was the villain in their midst. And it didn't stop there. By Friday, she had gathered a dozen neighbors at my shoreline, snapping photos as they held signs demanding community water access, fair fees, staging the kind of protest you'd expect outside government buildings, except here it was for my dock, my buoys, my name whispered into group chats I never signed up for. Some held their heads high beside her, true believers. Others shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting apologies in my direction as Paula choreographed her show. On Saturday, flags appeared in my backyard overnight. Orange markers jammed into my soil in lines that didn't match any legal survey I'd ever seen, like ghost surveyors had crept through to redraw the land. I photographed everything, plucked them up, stashed them in the garage, filed even her harassment away like evidence, because that's what this was turning into now. Documentation, not conversation. Sunday finally cracked through the wall when Sophie Clark knocked at my door, a quiet woman from 3 blocks away with gentle eyes, holding nothing but a bottle of water, speaking low like she was smuggling contraband as she admitted, "Something about this isn't right." Apologizing for the mess, confessing she'd seen Paula Twist stories before. After a few murmured assurances, she slipped me a folded scrap of paper inside the empty water bottle. A phone number, scrawled over the message, "Text me. Something's wrong with HOA finances." That note sat heavy in my palm long after she left. The first sign that behind Paula's bluster was something darker. Money moving where sunlight never reached. By Monday, as Paula staged a live stream outside my door with professional microphones and lights, calling me selfish, her words polished into propaganda, I finally realized this was no neighborhood squabble. This was war, scripted, seasoned, and waged by someone who ruled with fear and paperwork. And I wasn't just the next victim. I was the first opponent ready to question her crown. That Monday evening after Paula's livestream circus in front of my house, when the lights and microphones finally disappeared and the crowd of self-righteous neighbors drifted home buzzing about the rule breaker on the lake, I sat in my living room staring at Sophie's note clenched in my hand, the word "something's wrong with HOA finances" glowing in my mind like a neon sign pointing toward a darker story hiding behind her flyers and props, and as Rachel tried to reassure Noah upstairs, telling him none of this chaos was his fault, I pulled out my grandfather's boxes once again, flipping through every survey, deed, tax record, every paper that smelled of dust and pine sap, hunting for clarity, and though the documents made clear that I paid separate property taxes, lake surface assessments included, the more important realization that night wasn't just that I had law on my side, it was that Paula wasn't protecting community rules. She was hiding something big enough to warrant, turning me into the villain, and Sophie's quiet courage in slipping me that note gave me my first ally in what had become open war. I texted the number she had scrawled, not sure if she'd answer, but within seconds a message lit up. "Meet me at the old boathouse tomorrow morning. No one goes there anymore, bring your phone." When dawn came, mist curled over the glass-flat surface of the lake, and I walked the short trail to the crumbling boathouse where peeling paint sagged off the boards like scales, my breath fogging in the cold air as Sophie appeared from the trees clutching a binder so heavy its spine bent under the strain. She looked over her shoulder as if expecting Paula's minions to burst out of the pines and seize it, then thrust it into my hands quickly as if holding it any longer might burn her fingers. "These are copies I made," she whispered. "Months of financial reports she wouldn't want anyone to see, expenses that don't add up, fees collected from families here that disappear into accounts no one can track, maintenance projects billed but never performed." My hands grew colder thumbing through the pages, finding line items like dock reinforcement, billed thousands of dollars without a single nail pounded in, lake filtration systems, charged to residents though I hadn't seen a shred of equipment installed, invoices with the faintest smudge of forged signatures. Sophie explained that she used to help Paula with clerical work, thought it was just volunteering at first, until she noticed whole meetings logged that never happened, votes recorded that no one had cast, her own name scribbled on minutes she wasn't present for. Paula was embezzling, siphoning funds through fake improvements, using fees as her personal account. Sophie's voice trembled but hardened with conviction as she said, "She's been doing this for years, but now that you're here, and resisting, she's scared you'll shine a light where no one else dared to look." I promised her silence and protection, and as we parted ways the weight of the binder bit into my arm with a new fire in my chest. Paula wasn't just bossy, she was a fraud. The following days were a blur of escalation. By Wednesday, Paula plastered new flyers accusing me of harassment, writing that I was endangering neighborhood harmony, crafting her narrative so slickly it fooled many. A documentation rally formed near my dock where she gathered her loyalists, posing in staged photos holding posters reading "Pay Your Share," while neighborhood kids stood confused in the background, dragged into her performance for the cameras. Meanwhile, my phone kept pinging with anonymous emails filled with bureaucratic jargon, citations of non-existent county statutes, all designed to grind me down with paperwork intimidation. She was good, too good. But as I laid Sophie's binder of documents on my dining room table each night, highlighting missing funds and fake receipts, the curtain began to lift. Thursday, it escalated into something darker. Surveyor flags reappeared in my yard, this time planted deliberately along crooked lines that would carve my dock off, splitting water access in ways no true surveyor would map. It was intimidation dressed as official action. I photographed each flag, pulled them up, bagged them as evidence, because at this point I realized Paula wasn't content to wait for courts. She was waging psychological warfare. Even simple acts like hauling in the kayak or raking leaves became spectacles as neighbors slowed cars to snap photos or glare openly. The whispers on their porches grew louder, and I found myself rehearsing explanations I never gave, trying to defend myself in imaginary debates while the real one brewed hotter. Then came the breaking point. Friday night, Paula staged a live town hall on Facebook, standing on the public sidewalk outside my property with a microphone clipped to her blazer, multiple tripods holding lights and cameras, flanked by her board. She looked like a politician giving a press conference, her hair immovable, her hand gestures crisp, her voice polished as she said, "One resident believes he owns an entire lake and can endanger community rights by refusing fees, claiming fraudulent ownership while stealing from every honest family here." She gestured to my house like it was a cathedral of corruption, hitting every emotional note. Family values, fairness, protecting children, and then came her slip. She said on stream, "I personally approve all lake spending," before catching herself, trying to correct to "the board approves." But I caught it. That little moment where her mask fell and showed the truth, that she saw herself not as a president but as a tyrant with private access to community funds, was the ember I needed. So I crafted my response, low budget, unpolished, standing at my dock in a simple jacket with my buoys behind me, phone in one hand, calm voice steady. "I've paid property taxes on this lake parcel for years. I'm standing on the dock my grandfather built. I don't know why this became a crusade, but I'd rather we talk as neighbors than stage shows." A minute long, posted to the same platform. The contrast was deliberate. Her Globo Theater versus my raw truth. To my surprise, it worked. Comments started popping up. Why would someone pay property taxes if they didn't own it? And has anyone actually read the bylaws she waves around? The tide wasn't turning yet, but the current was shifting. Paula noticed too. Saturday morning, fresh abuse arrived in my mailbox. An envelope that looked like a gag order, demanding in bold legal language that I cease false statements undermining HOA authority. I almost laughed. It had no seal, no docket, nothing but Paula's signature on fancy header paper. Theater again, intimidation disguised as law. When I refused to sign, her mask cracked, her visits grew sharper, her attempts colder, quieter, less performed for the camera but more desperate, as if she felt the cracks widening beneath her throne. And then Sophie sent me proof. An email with photos of Paula's private office, her calendar open, scribbled notes about emergency meetings that never occurred, maintenance approvals signed on days when not a soul worked at the water, meetings fabricated, funds misappropriated. The fraud was no longer speculation. It was visible ink and paper. Paula didn't know I had it yet, and as I stared at those photos late into the night, hearing every creak of the old house like the lake itself murmuring justice, I felt a strange calm. For the first time since she knocked on my door, I wasn't cornered. I wasn't alone. And I wasn't just defending buoys anymore. I was about to expose an empire of lies. Saturday arrived with the kind of gray, heavy sky that felt like a stage curtain waiting to lift. The smell of damp leaves thick in the air as neighbors lugged lawn chairs and picnic baskets toward the community pavilion for what was billed as the annual water festival but which Paula had carefully converted into something more sinister, a public trial dressed as a celebration. Her personal theater where she expected to destroy my credibility and stamp her crown into the gravel once and for all. Children were dragging coolers, vendors laid out tables of snacks, the sound of laughter drifted here and there, but it all felt muted under the weight of what was about to happen, because at one end of the pavilion Paula had set up a makeshift courtroom with a folding table draped in velvet, 3 bulging binders stacked like scripture, a portable microphone clipped to her blazer, and her ever-present entourage buzzing around her nervously while she smiled, waved, and shook hands like she was running for office, her confidence obvious in every sharp angle of her gesture, and watching her made my legs tense with the fear of knowing she had perfected this routine for years, using spectacle, noise, and fake authority to bend neighbors like reeds in stiff wind. For a fleeting moment, standing at the back with my projector case and Sophie clutching her folder, I almost believed she would succeed. Paula began with a performance worthy of a courtroom drama, her HOA lawyer rising beside her in a dark suit, speaking grave words about community harmony, shared resources, and the violator hiding behind false technicalities, while Paula clicked through large poster boards showing blown-up flyers of me standing on my dock, red arrows circling my buoys like they were contraband evidence from a crime scene. The crowd murmured, some shaking their heads at me, others whispering uneasily, the momentum hers, her narrative polished so well I could almost forget she was a fraud. 20 minutes in, when her lawyer rolled up survey sketches projected onto an easel, shaky and vague but dramatic in tone, pointing to areas labeled community access zones, Paula tossed her head, arms wide, declaring, "This man wants to privatize what belongs to all of you. He claims ownership of what our association has legally managed for decades. If we allow him, what happens next? Your children banned from fishing, your families denied swimming, your voices stolen." The theater stirred neighbors to murmurs of outrage, the smell of tension in the air like static before lightning. But then came my turn, and in that moment between their applause and my silence, I felt the whole pavilion's eyes weigh on me heavy as stones. Sophie squeezed my arm. It was time. I wheeled forward my projector, set it on a table, hooked it to my laptop, and in seconds the wall behind us filled not with flyers or fuzzy sketches but with crisp county survey maps overlaid in translucent precision across the actual lake outside the pavilion's wide windows. My voice was steady, soft at first, but it cut through the low buzz as I said, "These aren't my drawings. These are county records, the same tax maps I've been paying on for years," and then I tapped the key that switched the slide to drone footage. Crisp aerial shots I had captured that week, the buoys visible bobbing against the water, overlay lines from the county survey aligning perfectly with markers, showing that my grandfather's parcel extended into the very waters Paula had labeled as community zones. Gasps rippled through the crowd, the visual impact sharper than any word. "I'm not stealing water," I went on. "I am maintaining what was already my family's. Taxes paid. Deeds registered. What Paula calls trespassing, the county calls ownership." The murmurs changed pitch. Where before they were skeptical, now they grew confused, questioning. Paula scrambled, shouting about misrepresented maps, her composure cracking as she demanded her lawyer counter. But the man in the dark suit only flipped pages nervously, eyes wide, realizing county records are not rhetoric. Then Sophie rose and her voice, clean, firm, filled the silence of doubt. "There's more," she said, holding up her binder. "In 2 years of collecting HOA fees, Paula billed over $25,000 for maintenance that never happened. Dock repairs, filtration systems, security patrols." She spread receipts across the table, her hands trembling but her eyes fierce. No contractors were ever hired. The money disappeared into accounts she controlled. Families here paid thousands and got nothing. The crowd erupted like a fuse had been lit. Neighbors who had nodded along with Paula's earlier speech now shouted, "Where's our money? I paid $400 for dock work. Where is it?" Paula's face drained to chalk as Sophie dropped printed spreadsheets showing line items, names, dates. Even the HOA lawyer stepped back, closing his briefcase. "I wasn't retained for this," he muttered, and slipped quietly toward the door, abandoning ship. And in that vacuum the truth roared alive. Voices rose, angry throngs demanding answers as Paula tried to hold the microphone, stammering excuses about complicated expenditures, sweat smudging her makeup as she fumbled papers that only made the lies worse. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt the tide fully, unmistakably turn. She shouted at me across the crowd, desperate. "You staged this, you and her, you violated my privacy, stole my papers." Her finger stabbed the air wildly, but the crowd had heard Sophie's steady voice, had seen the undeniable drone footage and county seals glowing across the wall. "You called the cops for buoys," a man barked at her, "while you pocketed our fees?" A woman demanded. "You paraded us for pictures. Meanwhile, nothing was fixed." The noise built, the audience no longer hers but alive with betrayal, their anger directed squarely at her throne. Paula pounded the table, shrieking about community standards. But when George Miller, the elder long respected by all, stood from the middle row and said evenly, "Enough," the pavilion fell still. His words landed like weighty gavel strikes. "You lied to us. You stole from us. And you made us fear the truth." In that silence, Paula's empire collapsed. She dropped the microphone, papers slipping to the ground. Her shoulders bent not under righteous indignation but the crushing weight of exposure. Sophie sat back down, exhausted but glowing, and I shut off the projector quietly, its fan whirring down as though cooling the fire. By the end of the day, neighbors who hours earlier gawked at me with suspicion approached with handshakes, apologies, hushed gratitude. Paula stormed from the pavilion red-faced, shouting threats of lawsuits into the air no one cared to breathe, stripped of lawyer, of credibility, of crown. And walking home that evening, Sophie at my side, the fall leaves swirling around our ankles, I realized the war wasn't over. Paperwork and courtrooms still waited, but the battle at the lake, the propaganda war, the theater had ended. For the first time since she knocked at my door demanding payment, I felt the ground solid beneath my feet. The cracks in her crown were no longer cracks. The whole crown had tumbled, shattering across the dock like brittle glass. And in its place stood truth, recorded, projected, undeniable, stronger than any flyer or poster she could plaster across lampposts. She had tried to drown me with spectacle, and spectacle had become her undoing. The weeks after the chaotic Water Festival showdown felt like the air before a thunderstorm, heavy, uncertain, humming with the inevitability of a strike, and sure enough, before long official subpoenas came crackling down like lightning bolts, pulling Paula Whitman out of her crumbling throne of HOA theatrics and into the cold precision of the county courthouse, a place where microphones and flyers no longer mattered, only facts, signatures, and sworn testimony. And walking through those tall oak doors for the first hearing, I felt the enormity of what was unfolding, the benches filled with neighbors who had days earlier cheered at her parades but were now leaning forward hungry for answers, Sophie at my side clutching a thick binder of financial reports, George Miller steady like the anchor he had always been, children's parents clutching folders of false invoices Paula had sent them over the years, everyone ready but nervous, the collective breath of a community finally putting its tormentor on trial. At the front table, Paula sat in an orange jumpsuit, not her proud navy blazer, not her polished stage presence, her hair tied back messily, lips pressed tight, eyes darting to corners of the courtroom like a trapped animal, and beside her was not the confident lawyer who had once strutted with her on festival stages but a weary public defender leafing through notes with a face that looked resigned, almost embarrassed. The charges read aloud that morning echoed like heavy bells: embezzlement, fraud, forgery of government documents, harassment, misuse of community funds, obstruction through false reports, and for each count the judge's tone carried a weight that pressed like stone against Paula's already bent shoulders. When the prosecution took the floor, it was as though every ounce of documentation Sophie and I had gathered had found its place in a single crescendo of truth finally breaking free of months of gaslighting. The county survey maps rolled out first, showing clear as daylight how my grandfather's deed extended into lake surface water she had claimed belonged to everyone. The tax receipts I had paid for years proof that her trespassing claims were baseless. Then came Sophie's spreadsheets laid carefully in front of the jury, each line a tale of theft. Dock maintenance charges with no dock repaired, filtration systems billed though no contractor ever came, lake patrol fees collected though no one ever patrolled, nearly $25,000 siphoned off under Paula's management, and murmurs rippled across the benches as neighbors leaned forward recognizing their own checks turned into her private account. Then Amanda, the clerk Paula had intimidated, stepped forward pale but resolute, admitting how Paula had forced her to forge meeting minutes for gatherings that never existed, to copy signatures onto approvals that were never voted on, her voice cracking as she said, "I'm sorry," to the entire room, tears making the pages in her hand quiver. George followed, carrying a notebook worn soft at the edges. Months of notes logged when Paula fined mothers for chalk drawings, when she plastered violator notices on families with dogs, when she used fear instead of care to keep everyone quiet. And his words, though not dramatic, cut deepest. She didn't protect us. She ruled us. And we forgot we had the right to say no. The defense tried to spin it, mumbling about misunderstandings, about passionate leadership maybe crossing a line, but each attempt landed limp. When Paula herself finally chose to speak, she reached for the same weapon she had always used, her voice. But in that vaulted room it rang hollow, her insistence that she was protecting property values drowned beneath the weight of the documents glowing on screens, beneath the faces of families she had drained of money and dignity. At one point she shouted that my drone footage was illegal surveillance, that Sophie had invaded her privacy, that we were the real criminals. But the judge silenced her with a stern rap of the gavel, reminding her this was not a live-streamed HOA stunt, it was court, and here evidence mattered more than volume. By the trial's end, it was almost anticlimactic, because everyone knew what the verdict would be. Guilty on multiple counts, restitution ordered for $25,000 to be paid back into residents' accounts, probation under federal investigation for the forged seals she had waved in people's faces, a 5-year ban from ever serving again on any HOA or community board in the county, and perhaps most humiliating for her, an order to dismantle the very fences and restricted access. Sign she had planted herself, tools placed in her own hands as neighbors watched her drills whine and her shoulders sagged, forced to destroy the paraphernalia of her own false empire. But the reckoning didn't just happen in that courtroom. It spilled back into Meadowbrook like cleansing rain. Within days the community convened, this time not under a banner Paula printed but under the collective decision of its angry, finally awakened residents, and the vote to dissolve the HOA entirely passed with near unanimity. People no longer wanted committees and bylaws twisted against them, they wanted transparency, cooperation, and freedom. Out went mandatory dues and required signatures, in came voluntary contributions to a neighbor-managed fund with rotating oversight, every dollar accounted for, receipts posted to bulletin boards, meetings recorded openly, and for the first time in years, people laughed at gatherings instead of whispering in fear. Sophie was hailed quietly as a hero, though she insisted, "I only did what was right." And Amanda found comfort in apologies from residents who admitted they hadn't seen how scared she had been all along. Neighbors who had turned suspicious eyes on me during the weeks of harassment came to shake my hand, bring pies, mutter regrets, telling me they had believed Paula's flyers only because her voice was louder than mine. The physical signs of change were just as satisfying, the tall HOA Lake Rules signage yanked out and carted away, replaced with a simple wooden board inscribed by volunteers. Meadowbrook Lake. For all neighbors, no fees, respect the water. The flyers branding me a trespasser were torn from walls, their red ink fading into trash, and graffiti once sprayed on Noah's backpack was replaced with drawings of fish he proudly sketched himself, carrying it to school with a new badge of pride. The restitution money Paula was forced to return became not just refunds but seed funding for real maintenance. Contractors hired this time with receipts and supervision. The dock finally got new reinforcements, safety rails added, life vests purchased for kids. The lake, once poisoned with suspicion, became clear water again, a gathering place instead of a battleground. Standing by the shoreline one quiet evening weeks after the sentencing, orange buoys bobbing peacefully where they belonged, I watched Noah cast his rod without flinching at strangers' eyes, and Rachel slip her arm through mine with relief written across her smile, and I thought about how close we had come to losing everything to one woman's confidence in her lies. She had shown all of us how fragile trust can be, how easy it is for one loud voice, brandishing papers and threats, to twist a neighborhood into submission. But she had also proven something stronger. That persistence, patience, and evidence cut through noise more cleanly than any gavel. Paula left that courtroom not just stripped of authority but stripped of the myth she had built around herself, forced to walk away under the same sun we all lived under, and behind her lay the ruins of an empire that never truly existed. The reckoning wasn't just hers. It was ours too. Because now neighbors no longer shook with fear when disputes arose. They talked, they debated, they resolved. Meadowbrook had been poisoned but was healing, and as the evening light painted gold across the lake, I realized the true verdict wasn't written in fines or sentences but in laughter echoing over water finally free. By the time winter settled over Meadowbrook and the last crimson leaves of autumn had fallen into the lake, the fiery storm Paula Whitman had whipped into our quiet community had become the kind of cautionary tale neighbors whispered about in lowered voices on porches, not so much because of what she'd done, though that was outrageous enough, but because of how close we had all come to letting one self-anointed queen dictate the rhythm of our lives with nothing but noise, threats, and paper. And, walking the shoreline in those colder mornings, frost glittering on the dock planks, orange buoys bobbing steadily in the water like sentinels that had withstood siege, I caught myself smiling at the irony that something as small and ordinary as buoy markers had ignited a war that dismantled years of fraud, toppled a would-be tyrant, and rebuilt a community from the ashes of fear. Life after the courtroom reckoning was startlingly calm, so calm it reminded me how unnatural the chaos had been. The knock on my door no longer meant a citation waved in my face but a neighbor coming to drop off cookies, or Sophie stopping by to hand me the latest transparent report from our new voluntary fund, her eyes brighter now that her courage was no longer a secret but a badge of honor. Amanda, once the trembling clerk forced to forge fake documents for Paula, found neighbors thanking her for coming clean, apologizing for thinking she had been complicit willingly, and though her hands still shook sometimes when she recounted how scared she had been under Paula's thumb, those same hands hung decorations at neighborhood cookouts, flipping burgers, laughing in voices that were once hushed. Even Noah changed, no longer shrinking when mail arrived, no longer clutching my arm when patrol cars passed the house. Instead he fished again with a broad grin, teaching kids his age how to cast from the same dock where his childhood nearly fractured, and one afternoon when he reeled in a trout almost too big for his small hands, he turned to me and said with pride that made my throat tighten, "Guess the buoys protected more than boats, huh, Dad? They protected us." And maybe he was right. Those floating markers had become more than plastic shells filled with air. They were emblems of a fight. The fight to stand firm, to question loudly, to not bow because one person says so. The neighbors, too, found new rhythm and freedom. Where once they whispered in fear of Paula's flyers and fines, now they met under open skies on Saturday mornings repairing docks together, clearing debris, organizing real maintenance projects with receipts pinned proudly on bulletin boards. The old HOA boardroom where Paula staged her false decrees was shuttered, its door left ajar to show nothing of value hid there anymore, and instead families gathered at the pavilion for potluck meals, where laughter rose higher than Paula's old microphones ever carried. Her restitution checks filtered through one by one, returning stolen dollars into wallets she had drained, and many neighbors, amazed at actually seeing money back, turned those refunds into voluntary contributions for the new community fund, doubling what Paula had ever squeezed under mandatory dues. And you could feel it, in every laugh, in every child splashing in the cold lake, in every handshake exchanged with trust, that Meadowbrook had transformed into what it should have been all along. Not a kingdom, but a neighborhood. Paula herself became nothing but rumor after sentencing. Her house foreclosed, her golf cart rusting, her name erased from local committee notes, and when strangers passed through town asking in hushed tones, "Is this where that HOA president was arrested for buoys?" The resident smiled, nodded, and told the story of the trial, never missing the detail that she had called the police because a man dared drop buoys in water already his. In time, the tale spread like folklore, and some even took to calling it the legend of the buoys, retold half with laughter, half with awe at how small things reveal big truths. The flyers she plastered once calling me a trespasser were now used by kids as scrap paper for doodles, or thumbtacked in the community center as Hall of Shame, reminders of how fragile peace can be if nobody questions bold voices. On quiet evenings I found myself on the porch, Rachel curled into the rocking chair beside me, Noah asleep upstairs clutching fishing magazines, and I would breathe deep the pine-tinged air feeling peace heavier and holier for having been hard won. Sometimes I'd flip through the binder I had built during those long weeks of harassment, the flyers, the fake orders, the survey flags, my own notes scrawled in margin saying don't give up when nights felt too heavy, and though part of me wanted to burn it all in a roaring fire, another part wanted it preserved, as proof that ordinary people can resist extraordinary lies if they're stubborn enough to chase truth with receipts. Sophie once told me at a fund meeting, "The lesson here isn't that we beat Paula, it's that we remembered we didn't need her to lead us," and George Miller added, with his steady elder gravitas, "A lake outlives any one voice, only trust keeps it safe." Their words echoed into me, became the creed I whispered quietly when I hammered in new signs around the shoreline, wooden plaques carved not with threats and fees but with simple words, "Respect the water." No fines. No mandates. Just a reminder of shared responsibility. The first spring after Paula's collapse, the community threw its biggest festival yet, not staged as trial, not orchestrated as propaganda, but honest celebration. The docks lined with colorful kayaks, smoke from grills twisting into the air, laughter spilling across the waves while bands of kids bounced between the booths. And at the center of it all, the buoys bobbed in the same steady line, a few neighbors decorating them with streamers, turning what Paula once painted as evidence of criminal trespass into the festival mascot, a symbol of victory. Looking at them, I laughed quietly, shaking my head at the absurd legacy. How something so ordinary marked the boundary of a fight that made us remember who we were. Families I once thought lost to Paula's side came forward at that festival, apologized, tears in their eyes, telling me how ashamed they were for believing her lies, and I simply told them the truth. You don't need to apologize. You stood where fear pushed you. We all did. What matters is you're standing free now. And so the days rolled on simple again, life humming at its intended rhythm, peace breathing strong. But still, in quiet moments when I sat on the dock watching the rippling orange line stretch across water my grandfather once fished, I thought about how fragile it had all been and how easily it could have vanished if I had folded, if Sophie had stayed silent, if Amanda had kept forging, if one stubborn buoy hadn't anchored me in resistance. Paula might have convinced us all that paper and noise outweighed truth, but she hadn't reckoned with how strong truth feels when you finally put it in front of everyone at once. Undeniable enough to cut through years of performance. That realization carried more weight than any gavel strike. It was the real verdict, not on Paula, but on us. The buoys stayed. The lake stayed. Trust returned. And Meadowbrook Lake was ours again, not through contracts, not through crowns, but because people finally chose cooperation over fear. Sitting there, I thought of my grandfather's steady hands lowering me into the same water decades ago, his voice rumbling. Remember, son, you don't own the water, you respect it. Now, after everything, I understood fully. Respect was never about dues or fines, never about authority shouted loudest. Respect was about standing together, about asking questions, about refusing lies no matter how official the paper looked. And maybe that's why the buoys bobbing calmly against the horizon at sunset made me smile. Because they weren't just boundary markers anymore. They were reminders that an entire neighborhood, once divided, now floated together, safe, steady, and free.